Next on News Talk, AM 1480 WLEA, The Newsmaker Show with Kevin Doran.
Brian O'Neill in for Kevin Doran this morning, and our regular Thursday guest, Dr. Christian Kopff, University of Colorado in Boulder, is our guest today. Dr. Kopff, thanks for calling in.
Hello, upstate New York.
Well, the Scottish independent vote is today. It's actually going on right now over in Scotland. Dr. Kopff, your thoughts on Scotland having a referendum on the possibility of breaking with England?
Well, we are starting to see the deep ethnicities coming back and forming a role in the new Europe, and Europe needs to confront that because these are people's deepest beliefs. You know, just a few months ago, the polls were indicating massive rejection of Scottish independence, and now that's all gone. It's absolutely jumping back and forth, you know, within the degree of error. The Scots Independence Party, Nationalist Party, goes back to the 20s and 30s. It has been a part of Scotland for a long time, and after all, we're talking about a country that is, as Great Britain, really was formed in about 1711. It was the same century we were formed. They're just a little bit older than we are. And the issue is whether it's working for the Scottish people. One of the fun things I saw of the Unionists claim was that, you know, they have all their nuclear submarines in Scottish ports, and they'd have to move them to English ports, and wouldn't this be inconvenient? And you're sitting there going, this is what the Scottish don't like, is that they put the dangerous things in their ports. So if there's an accident with a nuclear submarine or if someone attacks it as a protest, it affects the Scottish people, not the English people.
Right.
After issue where the English decide that it should be the Scots to lead the charge. And the Scots want to have the right to at least have a strong voice in that.
Pat Buchanan seems to support Scotland breaking with the British Empire. Buchanan advised Scottish people not to worry about Goldman Sachs being forceful and clumsy in how the company is against breaking with England. Goldman Sachs against Scotland breaking with England. They're warning against financial crises if that happens. No big surprise there from Pat Buchanan. Dr. Kopff, next logical question. If the British Empire leaves Scotland, would they leave Northern Ireland?
Well, the British are taking the position that Great Britain, including Northern Ireland and Wales, are this wonderful unity and should always remain together. And it makes more sense for the British to get out of Northern Ireland, although it makes a lot of sense for them to get out of Scotland. But at least in the case of Scotland, they're part of the same island. Whereas in the case of Northern Ireland, really, it's a different situation. And I sincerely wonder if Ireland hasn't reached a condition now where they are ready to get together, or whether this would not be, you know, a positive move. We all understand during the Irish Revolution that there was a lot of hostility, and that includes killing and hurting people. And, of course, breaking them up was the easiest way to handle it. But, you know, now that is 20 and 30 years ago, and it may be time for Northern Ireland to break away from Britain and to join up with their southern neighbors.
Moving on to ISIS and ISIL and President Barack Obama and Obama's handling on that situation. Obama said on Wednesday he's not sending foot soldiers now back to Iraq. He's kind of wavered on this, taking different positions. Now he's saying that when the U.S. sends troops overseas and then eventually leaves that country, everything falls apart in the country after the troops come back to America. Your thoughts on that statement from President Obama?
Well, I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this. His initial position when he was running for the presidency was he was going to take out the troops in 1 year. When he actually became president, he then revised that and used the plan developed by Vice President Cheney to make a 3 or 4 year period of removal. As we got there, it was clear that timetable was too optimistic, and that the Iraqi army still needed further training and further support. And instead, he takes everybody out hastily when we could have stayed there with just 10,000 troops. Now, if we're going to get back in, we're going to need 30,000 troops. And his statement is, whenever we leave, things collapse. That's absurd. If we leave hastily and without proper taking care of the proper needs, of course things will fall apart. But things have fallen apart because he was too rash in his decisions, not because when America leaves places they fall apart. Europe, France didn't fall apart when our troops left there. There are plenty of places that don't fall apart when we leave. I bet Japan wouldn't fall apart, or Germany, if we got our troops out of there. Iraq is a difficult situation, but by moving too dramatically and too radically and by ignoring the general's advice, he's created this situation, and is unfortunately typical of him. He doesn't want to take responsibility for it.
Wondering, one conservative said to me recently that Obama could have taken on ISIS earlier and absolutely refused to, and that's why we're in the situation right now. Would you agree with that?
It's complicated, but had we had a reasonable, not large, military presence in Iraq and moved using those forces with the support of the Iraqi forces as support troops, we probably could have at least kept ISIS in Syria. And by removing our troops so rapidly, and when the Iraqi army was not really ready, that created the situation in which they were able to expand into Iraq and now control an area, as we all say over and over again, about the size of Belgium.
There was an article entitled ISIS or ISIL, Does It Matter What We Call Terrorist Groups? And it was actually, Dr. Kopff, on MTV News, of all places. Now, ISIS stands for Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. ISIL stands for Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. Dr. Kopff, MTV raises an interesting question. Does it matter what we call them, ISIS or ISIL?
It matters to the extent that Levant is the entire area of the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, so they're making a larger claim when it's the Levant. Whereas in Syria, they're only claiming to be part of already existing nations, and the hope, of course, is to take them over. In the case of Levant, they plan to take over the whole Near East, frankly, but certainly the part along the coast of the Mediterranean. And that's a much more dangerous and much more much stronger claim on their part. We should probably stick to saying Iraq and Syria.
We're talking with Dr. Christian Kopff here on the Newsmaker Show. Dr. Kopff, wondering, did you see that the Pope was warned of threats against his life from ISIS militants?
Yes, I mean, it's funny because all he's called for is peace and stopping the violence. He has not called for any particular policy or denounced Islam in any particular way. But you cannot even speak on this topic without putting your life at risk.
There were also reported threats. I saw a link to that on the Drudge Report. Reported threat, not actually a threat technically, same thing. Advice made by someone claiming to be ISIS supporters on some social media network or online somewhere on how to attack New York City if you're already there. That was pretty alarming.
Well, we know that New York has been one of their goals now. They were successful at 9/11. They tried again a few years later at Times Square. And actually, in the 1990s, there was an attempt to put bombs in the parking garage of the Twin Towers, which still existed. So New York is for them the symbol of our global hegemony as an economic hegemony. Washington obviously represents our political and military hegemony. But New York is a very big symbol for those who oppose America's position in the world for whatever reason. And yes, I think it's very upsetting. Though it must be said, we are now also arresting people in Colorado as planning jihad and recruiting for jihad.
Really? Tell us about that.
New York have a problem. We have a problem too.
Tell us more about that.
Well, we're now actually taking seriously the various plans of the people using, social media and going around recruiting people, finding out names from the local mosques, and then, however, not just using those names, but actually recruiting and changing these young people's views. And among the places, as you know, there are a number of. I'm having trouble getting a hold of my story here. We now have a number of people in Wisconsin who've been arrested for spreading jihad. Right now, 19-year-old Shannon Conley of Arvada, which is a suburb like Boulder, right outside Denver, has pled guilty to a count of conspiracy to provide support to terrorist organizations. This was a young person, converted as a young person. She's a girl. Shannon's a girl's name, and she's been working with jihadists and trying to also get the material and try and convert people who will go over and fight with ISIS. She's been working with various ISIS-affiliated people, most of them not Americans, most of them Tunisian or Near Eastern. But she was captured by the feds at Denver International Airport, and her luggage had propaganda, had material on first aid in battlefields. She was planning on the battlefields, and also DVDs recording the speech of Anwar al-Awlaki, who's the jihadi counselor that President Obama blew up. And we also have the names of a couple of other such people. Jamie Paulin Rodriguez was sentenced 8 years in federal prison in January here in Denver. She came from Leadville in Colorado, and she was helping people build pipe bombs and training them to shoot guns in order to aim at jihad. Of course, totally legitimate to do some of these things. Let's learn how to use a gun. But the point of it was to use in jihad. So we have a number of cases now here in Colorado of people who are actively involved in promoting jihad, both from the propaganda point of view, but also in some cases actually from the physical material point of view. And of course, Wisconsin has had several cases, and I entirely agree. New York State in general, and New York City in particular, needs to worry about that.
We're talking with Dr. Christian Kopff on the Newsmaker Show today. Brian O'Neill in for Kevin Doran. When we get back, we're going to be talking about censorship, modern-day censorship. Stay with us. Talking today with Dr. Christian Kopff on the Newsmaker Show. Brian O'Neill filling in for Kevin Doran. Dr. Kopff, censorship. Between kids in high school being told to go home because the school didn't like the shirt they had on if it was sometimes patriotic, and the quarterback of Washington in that situation. Let's start out with the kids in school. We haven't had any situations like that around here, but there have been some nationwide. Your thoughts there?
Well, there are all these rules, and in inner cities they make sense because there are gangs, that have special shirts and T-shirts and hats and things. But we're talking about the middle-class places. There was one southern place where a bunch of the kids wanted to put American flags on their trucks and drive around the school to show, it's Constitution Day, or it was when this happened, and they were going to show their patriotism and honor the Constitution. And the school insisted that there was a definite rule about these things, and they hadn't been properly approved, and they had to take the American flag down. And we've had a number of cases like this in California. There was another school where kids were wearing American flag T-shirts, and were told they couldn't wear them. Gotten so politically correct, they're terrified of offending anybody, and it turns out that the cross and the flag offend people.
Dr. Kopff, how about that football player RG3?
Yes, Robert Griffin III. He's a wonderful quarterback and very charismatic. He plays for the Redskins. And he hurt him. He didn't hurt himself. Enormous person jumped on him, obviously. But he got hurt in the last game, so they had a press conference, and he came out with a nice little T-shirt that said, "No Jesus, no peace," and it was painted in a funny way because also, with the letters, if you saw them a certain angle, it was also "No Jesus, no peace." And the league, the National Football League, told him, no, this was strictly forbidden. He could not come out and wear that. And the reason they gave was that they had a a deal with Nike to produce all their T-shirts, and no one could wear a non-Nike-produced T-shirt in a public event of the National Football League. But, of course, everybody thinks the reason is that he wore a T-shirt that said something positive about Jesus Christ.
Dr. Kopff, on the topic of NFL, did you have a take on the Ray Rice situation?
Well, there are two issues there, and one is obviously his behavior, but the other is the way that the league really doesn't want to confront it and insisted that they knew nothing about it when there's now very good evidence that they had the most damaging tape months and months ago, confirmed by a phone call confirming the tape. And they've really made themselves look as people who care more about money and endorsements than they care about, athletic standards, high moral standards, all the rest of it. Athletes are role models. And we're sorry that, Charles Barkley has denounced that, and Charles Barkley has also defended Ray Rice and Adrian Peterson. But the fact is they are, and the league, if it wants to maintain its popularity, needs to understand that they need to make enough money to keep it going, but that ultimately the high ethical standards are what make watching football worth doing. And if they, just to have a few more endorsements, cover up serious problems that are going on, like the Ray Rice and the Adrian Peterson ones, people are going to decide, I'm sorry, this is not for me. This is not an honest sport anymore. And that's, what happened to baseball in the early 1920s. It was terrible scandals, and it was saved by people like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and, wonderful stars like that. But football needs to face the fact that if money's more important than ethics, they may find out that they have neither.
New York U.S. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand gave an interview to the Huffington Post where she talked about being harassed on her way up in politics. And she also wants to sit Congress on the NFL and have congressional hearings on that topic.
Yes, I do think that's a mistake. I think it's not something for the federal government to intervene in. Everybody now is offended, and everybody now is... I just came from a little mini conference in which we talked about, as teachers, having to deal with a situation where students get offended on different sides of issues every time you try and bring a controversial topic up. And nowadays, everything's controversial. And so, Gillibrand, people didn't always treat me right. They took you seriously and expected you to compete and defend yourself. And the last thing we need is the federal government putting down these strict rules, no exception rules. What we do need is for the teams to take the responsibility to maintain high ethical standards. And if they're not going to do that, then it's bad for the country. But certainly we don't want the federal government to be intervening in this. It's completely wrong.
Not that it was not a much more trivial topic, but didn't Congress intervene back in the 50s or early 60s during the game show scandals when it turned out that they were actors on the game shows and they were reading scripts?
Yes,
and I mean contestants. The contestants were actors.
Yeah, I mean there was a fun Robert Redford movie. He directed a called Game Show about that scandal, and they were having practice sessions which they were using the questions they were going to use on the show, so they'd know the answers. And yes,
right.
Congress had to intervene. Congress does nothing else, right? They're not responding to taxes, they're not responding to immigration, and yet here they are intervening in the 50s in game shows and intervening now, wanting to intervene in the football league. After all, Harry Reid wants Congress to change the name of the Washington Redskins.
Harry Reid, by the way, you talk about Kirsten Gillibrand, he stepped in it, and they didn't make as big a deal of it, I think, as they would if it had come from the right when he talked about Kirsten Gillibrand's looks. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. Now, he's gotten away with murder. A Republican who'd made comments he made about the way President Obama talks, about Gillibrand. He's made a whole bunch of these comments, which anybody else would have been driven out of public life had it been done by Mitch McConnell or Ted Cruz, and instead he gets away with it all the time.
Dr. Christian Kopff, any final thoughts before we go?
Well, I just think that I do think the country is still healthy, but I do think we need to be able to stand up and, send a little tweet to RG3 and tell him we support him. But don't send a tweet to Ray Rice, please.
Dr. Kopff, thank you very much.
My pleasure.